Flight was invented 3 times independently. Insects, birds, bats. That is what the textbooks say, and it is not entirely accurate. Flight was invented 4 times, and the first time was the most mysterious. There is a creature that lived on this earth. It weighed 250 kilograms. It stood as tall as a giraffe. And it flew. Not glided, not jumped from a cliff and hoped for the best. It flew, with beating wings, active powered flight, presumably covering thousands of kilometers without landing. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the largest flying creature in the entire history of life on Earth. A wingspan of 11 meters, a head the size of a human being on a neck longer than a giraffe's. And every time scientists try to build a working model of how it actually got airborne, they run into contradictions. Physics says it was impossible. The fossil record says it happened. One of them is wrong. But before we get to the giants, we need to understand where it all began. Pterosaurs appeared in the Triassic period and were immediately perfect flyers. No intermediate creatures with half wings awkwardly gliding from tree to tree. No transitional ancestors learning to fly and leaving us fossils of their failed attempts. The first known pterosaur, Eudimorphodon, which lived 230 million years ago, already had complex teeth for catching fish, a fully developed wing, and, judging by its brain structure, the vestibular system of a pilot rather than a lizard. Evolution skipped the rough draft. 200 years of paleontology and we still have not found that page. They ruled the skies for 160 million years. Birds have ruled the skies for 66 million. We have not reached half of what pterosaurs achieved. This is their story. Before we go further, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It genuinely helps us keep making work like this. Thank you. To understand the world of pterosaurs, you first have to understand the world they inherited. And that world was, by any reasonable measure, a catastrophe in the process of becoming something new. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago, killed somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species, and approximately 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. Paleontologists sometimes call it the Great Dying, and that name is not an exaggeration. It was the closest life on Earth has ever come to simply stopping. The oceans became acidic. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere fluctuated dramatically. Global temperatures spiked in pulses driven by volcanic activity on a scale difficult to comprehend. A series of eruptions in what is now Siberia that released carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere over a period of perhaps 1 million years, covering an area of land larger than Western Europe, in basalt 2 kilometers deep. When you try to imagine the aftermath, the word recovery feels inadequate. What followed the Great Dying was not recovery in any comfortable sense. It was reconstruction from almost nothing. The early Triassic world, the world into which the ancestors of pterosaurs were born, was hot, dry in many places, and ecologically thin. The vast supercontinent of Pangaea dominated the geography of the planet. A single landmass stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa. The interior of Pangaea was characterized by extreme seasonal swings, brutal summers, and cold winters, because there was no moderating ocean influence anywhere near the center of the continent. The coastlines were more habitable, bathed by monsoon rains and warmed by shallow tropical seas. But even there, the diversity of life was a shadow of what it had been before the extinction. The dominant large animals of the early Triassic were creatures called archosaurs, a broad group that would eventually give rise to crocodilians on one branch and dinosaurs and birds on another. But in the early Triassic, none of these famous lineages had yet emerged. The world was open. Ecological niches that had been occupied for hundreds of millions of years were suddenly vacant. And evolution, which abhors a vacuum as much as physics does, began to fill them. The sky was the most conspicuous vacancy of all. Insects had been flying for 150 million years by this point, since the Carboniferous period, and some of them had reached extraordinary sizes. Dragonfly relatives with wingspans of 65 centimeters had patrolled the Carboniferous forests, but no vertebrate had ever flown. The sky above the surface of the Earth, from just above the treetops to the upper limits of what biology could reach, was completely unoccupied by any creature with a backbone. It had been that way since the first vertebrate crawled onto land more than 350 million years earlier. That is an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of ecological opportunity going untouched. When the first pterosaurs finally took to the air, sometime in the middle to late Triassic, they were not competing with anything. They had the entire sky to themselves. This raises the most fundamental question in pterosaur research, a question that has generated more debate than almost any other in the field of paleontology. Where did they come from, and how did they get there? The origin of pterosaur flight is what scientists call a ghost lineage problem. We have excellent fossils of fully formed pterosaurs. We have essentially no fossils of their ancestors. The transition from whatever ground-dwelling or tree-dwelling reptile gave rise to pterosaurs to the fully capable flying animal represented by Eudimorphodon is simply not preserved in the fossil record in any meaningful way. This is not unusual in paleontology. Fossilization is a rare accident, and transitional forms are often the least likely to be preserved because they existed in smaller populations for shorter periods of time than the successful lineages they gave rise to. But in the case of pterosaurs, the gap is particularly stark, and it has led to genuinely fierce disagreements among researchers about what the ancestors of pterosaurs looked like and how flight actually began. There are two broad camps in this debate, and they have been arguing for decades. The first camp favors what is called the trees down hypothesis, sometimes called the arboreal origin of flight. In this model, the ancestors of pterosaurs were tree-climbing animals that developed gliding ability first, using an extended membrane between their limbs to slow their descent, and that powered flapping flight evolved gradually from this gliding foundation. This is an intuitive model because it requires less initial energy expenditure. Gliding is easier than flying. You start high up, you spread something to slow yourself down, and gravity does most of the work. The second camp favors the ground-up hypothesis, which argues that flight evolved in small, fast-running ground animals that used their proto-wings first for balance, then for generating thrust, then eventually for lift. This model has more support from the study of bird flight origins, where evidence increasingly suggests that feathers and wing-like structures were useful for running, leaping, and stabilizing before they were useful for actual flight. Neither hypothesis has conclusively won the argument for pterosaurs, largely because we do not have the transitional fossils that would settle the question. What we do know is that when pterosaurs appear in the record, they are already so specialized for flight that working backwards from their anatomy is like trying to figure out how an aircraft was designed by looking only at a finished plane and no engineering drawings. The wing of a pterosaur is structurally unlike the wing of any other flying vertebrate that has ever existed. A bird's wing is built from modified arm and hand bones, with feathers extending the surface area. A bat's wing is a membrane stretched between elongated fingers, all four of the inner fingers extended to support the wing surface. A pterosaur's wing was supported primarily by a single dramatically elongated fourth finger, the equivalent of your ring finger, which extended outward from the hand to support a membrane called the patagium that stretched back to the body and hind limb. The other three fingers were small and clawed, used for grasping when the animal was on the ground or in trees. The wing was essentially a one-finger construction. It is a solution that no other evolutionary lineage ever arrived at independently, which tells you something both about its uniqueness and about the improbability of reconstructing how it arose. The patagium itself, the wing membrane, was not a simple sheet of skin. Recent analysis of exceptionally preserved specimens, particularly from deposits in Germany and Brazil, where soft tissue impressions have survived alongside bone, shows that the patagium was a complex, actively controlled structure. It contained muscle fibers running through it, a network of stiffening fibers called actinofibrils, and a rich blood supply. The wing was not passive like the sail of a sailboat, adjusted only by changing the angle of the supporting bones. It was more like a sophisticated airfoil that the animal could actively modify in shape and tension, the way a modern pilot adjusts control surfaces on an aircraft wing. This level of wing complexity in the earliest pterosaurs we know suggests either that flight evolved with remarkable speed, or that there are many millions of years of pterosaur evolution we simply have not found yet. The world those first pterosaurs flew over was stranger than anything alive today. Pangaea was beginning to pull apart in the late Triassic, and the rifting of the supercontinent was creating new seaways and coastal environments that had not existed before. The climate was warmer globally than today, with no permanent polar ice caps, and the distribution of climatic zones was different from anything on the modern Earth. The forests were dominated not by flowering plants, which had not yet evolved, but by conifers, ferns, and seed ferns, vegetation that looked superficially familiar but was composed of entirely different species from anything alive today. The dominant large animals on land were the archosaurs in their various early forms, including the ancestors of crocodilians called pseudosuchians, which in the Triassic were far more diverse and ecologically dominant than their modern descendants. Dinosaurs existed in the Triassic, but they were not yet the dominant terrestrial animals they would become in the Jurassic. They were medium-sized at best, and they shared the landscape with a menagerie of other archosaurs that have since gone extinct without leaving familiar descendants. Into this world, the first pterosaurs emerged as something genuinely novel. Vertebrate animals that could fly, that could exploit food sources and habitats completely inaccessible to everything else with a backbone. Eudimorphodon, our first good evidence of pterosaur existence, was found in northern Italy in rocks dating to approximately 230 million years ago, making it one of the earliest known pterosaurs. It was not a large animal. Its wingspan was approximately 1 meter, its body roughly the size of a crow, and it weighed perhaps a kilogram or two. But what makes Eudimorphodon so scientifically remarkable is precisely how complete and specialized it already was. Its teeth were complex, multi-cusped structures suited for gripping slippery fish, suggesting it was an active aerial fisherman. Its brain, inferred from the shape of the skull cavity, was enlarged in the regions associated with processing visual information and maintaining balance and spatial orientation. Its inner ear, visible in detailed fossil specimens, shows the enlarged semicircular canals associated with animals that make rapid three-dimensional maneuvers. This is not a transitional creature exploring the possibilities of flight. This is an animal that has already been flying for long enough that its entire anatomy has been optimized for it. If Eudimorphodon is the first chapter of the pterosaur story that we can read, there are clearly earlier chapters we have not found. What those missing chapters might contain has become a topic of genuine excitement in recent years, as new fossil discoveries have pushed back the boundaries of what we know about early archosaur evolution. A group of small bipedal archosaurs called lagopetids, known from fossils in Argentina, Brazil, and other locations, has been identified as possibly representing the closest known relatives of pterosaurs, based on detailed analysis of their skeletal anatomy. Lagopetids were ground-dwelling animals with no obvious adaptations for flight, which would seem to support a ground-up origin for pterosaur flight. But the gap between a lagopetid and a pterosaur is still enormous, and the debate is far from resolved. What the lagopetid discovery does is give us a new starting point for the question, a rough location on the archosaur family tree where pterosaur ancestry is most likely to be found, even if the precise sequence of anatomical changes that led from that starting point to a flying animal remains unknown. The Triassic period ended approximately 201 million years ago with another mass extinction, smaller than the Great Dying, but still significant, caused again by massive volcanic activity, this time the eruptions associated with the opening of the Atlantic Ocean as Pangaea continued to fragment. This end Triassic extinction wiped out many of the archosaur lineages that had dominated the Triassic landscape, clearing the ecological stage for what came next. What came next in the Jurassic period was the golden age of dinosaurs on land and the extraordinary diversification of pterosaurs in the air. The two groups were not competitors in any direct sense. They occupied completely different ecological spaces. Dinosaurs dominated the ground. Pterosaurs dominated the sky. And in the Jurassic, pterosaurs began to demonstrate just how many different ways there were to make a living in the air. The Jurassic pterosaurs fall into two broad groups that were long recognized as fundamentally different in their body plans. The Rhamphorhynchoids, named after the genus Rhamphorhynchus, were the more primitive group, retaining features that the earliest pterosaurs had possessed. Long tails stiffened by bony extensions that helped stabilize them in flight. Relatively small heads compared to their body size, and in many cases, teeth adapted for catching fish. Rhamphorhynchus itself is known from beautiful fossils from the Solnhofen limestone deposits of Bavaria, Germany, the same ancient lagoon environment that preserved the first specimens of Archaeopteryx, the earliest known bird. The Solnhofen fossils are remarkable for their detail, preserving not just bones, but soft tissue impressions of the wing membrane, the webbing between the foot bones, and in some cases, even the shape of the head crest. Rhamphorhynchus was a wingspan of approximately 1.5 meters in the larger specimens, and its long, stiff tail ended in a diamond-shaped vane, a rudder-like structure that it may have used to help steer during the tight banking maneuvers required for catching fish at the water's surface. The pterodactyloids, the group that includes Pterodactylus and all its relatives, were the more derived group, characterized by shorter tails, longer necks, and a much greater diversity of head shapes, many of them featuring elaborate crests. The pterodactyloids were the group that would eventually produce the giants, and they were also the group that showed the most ecological flexibility, adapting to an enormous range of feeding strategies and habitats. While the rhamphorhynchoids were primarily fish-eaters, living near coastal and lacustrine environments, the pterodactyloids branched out into forms specialized for catching insects, scooping fish while wading in shallow water, probing shoreline sediments for invertebrates, and, in the case of some of the largest forms, doing something that looked much more like the feeding behavior of large ground-dwelling predators than anything we associate with flying animals. The head crests of pterodactyloids deserve particular attention because they are among the most visually spectacular structures in the entire fossil record, and their function has been a source of genuine scientific debate for decades. The crests took an extraordinary variety of forms. Some species had low, bony ridges running along the top of the skull. Others had tall, blade-like crests rising from the snout or the back of the head. Tupuxuara, from the Cretaceous of Brazil, had a massive, rounded crest that gave its head a shape somewhat reminiscent of a guitar pick. Tapejara had a crest of soft tissue, supported by a bony core that extended both forward from the snout and upward from the skull, creating a structure that, in profile, looked like a large decorative fin. Nyctosaurus, a later Cretaceous form, had a crest consisting of two long bony prongs extending from the skull, forming a shape like a tall letter Y, with evidence suggesting that in life these prongs supported a large sail-like membrane. In terms of proportion to skull size, Nyctosaurus had perhaps the most dramatic headgear of any vertebrate that has ever lived. What were these crests for? The aerodynamic function has been proposed and largely discredited because many of the crests are oriented in ways that would increase rather than decrease air resistance, and because species living in the same environments often had dramatically different crest shapes, which is inconsistent with the idea that crest shape was being optimized for flight performance. The most widely supported current hypothesis is that the crests were primarily visual signals, used for species recognition, for signaling social status, and for attracting mates. This would make them functionally analogous to the elaborate plumage of peacocks or the antlers of deer, structures whose cost in terms of energy and aerodynamic penalty is worth paying because of the reproductive advantages they confer. Support for this hypothesis comes from several directions. First, within species where multiple specimens are known, there is variation in crest size that may correlate with sex, with larger crested individuals potentially being males and smaller crested or crestless individuals being females, though this interpretation is disputed. Second, the crests in many species contain a network of blood vessels that would have allowed blood to flush into the crest and change its color, providing a dynamic visual display that would have been invisible in dried fossil specimens, making the crests potentially even more impressive in life than in death.
There is also a less obvious but fascinating possibility that some large crests may have functioned as thermal regulators, helping the animal shed excess body heat during sustained flapping flight, which generates substantial metabolic heat. Large vascularized surfaces exposed to airflow are effective heat exchangers, and the crest would have been in exactly the right position at the front of a flying animal to benefit from cooling airflow. This function would not be mutually exclusive with the signaling hypothesis. The most elegant evolutionary solutions often solve multiple problems simultaneously. The question of pterosaur physiology, specifically whether they were warm-blooded in the way that birds and mammals are warm-blooded, was for a long time one of the most contentious in the field. The conventional assumption for decades was that pterosaurs, as reptiles, were ectothermic, relying on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature, as modern lizards and crocodilians do. This assumption was challenged by the discovery of pycnofibers, a type of integumentary covering found on pterosaur specimens from several exceptionally preserved localities. Pycnofibers are fine, hair-like filaments that covered the bodies of many, if not most, pterosaur species, and they are now understood to be a form of insulation functionally analogous to hair in mammals and down feathers in birds. The presence of insulation is a strong indicator of endothermy, because insulation only makes adaptive sense if an animal is generating its own body heat and needs to retain it. A cold-blooded animal living in a warm environment gains nothing from insulation, and in many respects would be disadvantaged by it. The discovery of pycnofibers, combined with analysis of pterosaur bone microstructure, showing rapid growth rates more consistent with endothermy than ectothermy, has led most researchers to conclude that pterosaurs were indeed warm-blooded, with high metabolic rates similar to those of modern birds. This conclusion has profound implications for how we understand pterosaur ecology and capability. A warm-blooded pterosaur could sustain powered flight for much longer than a cold-blooded one, because it could generate and maintain the high metabolic output that continuous wing beating requires. It could remain active at night and in cool weather. It could inhabit higher latitudes where temperature-dependent metabolic limitations would have grounded a cold-blooded flyer. Warm-bloodedness, in short, is not just a detail of physiology. It is a capability multiplier that expands the ecological range of an animal dramatically. And it fits with the fossil evidence we have of pterosaurs living in environments ranging from tropical coastal settings to what appear to be seasonally cool upland environments, a geographic range inconsistent with strict ectothermy. The discovery that pycnofibers are not unique to pterosaurs has added another layer of complexity to the story. Recent analysis has suggested that pycnofibers and the early feathers of dinosaurs may be homologous structures, meaning they derive from the same ancestral structures in the common ancestor of pterosaurs and dinosaurs, rather than having evolved independently in each lineage. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests that the ancestor of all archosaurs, the group that includes pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and their relatives, may have already possessed some form of filamentous integumentary covering, and that the scales of modern crocodilians represent a loss of this covering rather than the ancestral condition. This is a genuinely revolutionary idea, and it remains controversial. but the evidence supporting it has grown steadily over the past decade, particularly from studies of the genetic development of scales and feathers in living birds and crocodilians. The Cretaceous period, which began approximately 145 million years ago and lasted until 66 million years ago, was the golden age of pterosaur gigantism. While the Jurassic had produced large pterosaurs, the largest Jurassic forms had wingspans of perhaps 3 to 4 meters, impressive but not extraordinary by the standards of what was coming. In the Cretaceous, pterosaurs began to grow to sizes that challenge our understanding of what is physically possible for a flying animal. And the group that pushed these limits furthest was the Azhdarchids, a family of pterodactyloids named after the Uzbek word for a mythological dragon, which seems entirely appropriate given what they turned out to be. Azhdarchids were characterized by extremely long necks, long, toothless beaks, relatively small wings compared to their body size, and proportionally long legs. They first appeared in the early Cretaceous and became increasingly dominant through the late Cretaceous, eventually becoming the most common large pterosaurs in many ecosystems around the world in the final tens of millions of years before the mass extinction. Their fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica, indicating a truly global distribution. And as the Cretaceous progressed, they grew larger and larger, reaching sizes that had never been seen before in any flying animal and have not been seen since. The largest known Azhdarchid, and therefore the largest known flying animal in the history of life, is Quetzalcoatlus northropi, described from fragmentary remains found in Texas in the 1970s.
The wingspan estimate of 10 to 11 meters has remained the consensus figure, though some researchers have proposed figures as high as 12 meters. To put this in concrete terms, 11 meters is approximately the wingspan of a Cessna 208 Caravan, a small commercial turboprop aircraft. The neck of Quetzalcoatlus was approximately 2.5 meters long, longer than many full-grown humans are tall. When standing on the ground, this animal would have looked you in the eye from a height of approximately 5.5 meters, roughly equivalent to a male giraffe. And yet, the bone walls of its skeleton were hollow, paper-thin in many places, the same weight reduction strategy used in bird bones, giving a total estimated mass of somewhere between 200 and 250 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large male gorilla or a very heavy motorcycle. This combination of enormous size and relatively low mass was achieved through a skeletal architecture that took hollow bone engineering to its absolute limit. The biomechanics of Quetzalcoatlus flight have been debated with genuine intensity, and the debate has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The core problem is that the standard aerodynamic models developed to analyze bird and bat flight do not straightforwardly accommodate an animal of this size. As flying animals get larger, the relationship between body mass and the wing area needed to generate sufficient lift changes in ways that eventually become prohibitive. Mass scales with the cube of linear dimensions, but wing area scales only with the square, meaning that as an animal doubles in size, its mass increases 8-fold, but its wing area increases only 4-fold. At some point, this scaling relationship means that a larger wing simply cannot generate enough lift to support a heavier body, no matter how fast the animal flaps or how efficiently its wings are shaped.
The question for Quetzalcoatlus is whether it was below or above this theoretical limit. Several research groups have attempted to model Quetzalcoatlus flight using computational methods, and the results have varied considerably. Some models suggest that powered flight was possible, but would have required a running takeoff, with the animal using its powerful hind limbs to sprint into the wind and generate enough airspeed for the wings to begin producing lift, in a manner somewhat analogous to an albatross taking off from a runway. Other models suggest that the hind limbs alone were insufficient and that the animal would have needed to use its large, muscular forelimbs as well in a quadrupedal launch, vaulting itself into the air and then spreading its wings once airborne. Mark Witten and Michael Habib proposed this quadrupedal launch model in detail, and it has gained considerable support, partly because the forelimbs of Ajdarchids are proportionally massive and clearly bore significant muscle attachments, more than would be needed simply for walking. If the forelimbs were used for launching, the takeoff would have looked something like a pole vaulter pushing off, with the animal converting its ground contact force into upward momentum at the moment of launch. Once airborne, with its enormous wingspan providing substantial gliding efficiency, sustained flight would have been considerably less energetically demanding than takeoff. There is still the question of what Quetzalcoatlus actually did with its flight capability, and here the evidence has produced one of the most surprising reversals in pterosaur research. For a long time, the largest pterosaurs were assumed to be aerial fishers, imagined as enormous skimmers or gannets cruising low over shallow seas and snatching prey from the water surface with their long beaks. This image made intuitive sense. Big wings, long beak, living near coastal environments. What else would such a creature do? The answer, it turned out, was something quite different. Detailed analysis of Ajdarchid anatomy, particularly of their neck structure, forelimb proportions and beak shape, has led most researchers to conclude that Ajdarchids were primarily terrestrial foragers rather than aerial fishers. Their necks, despite their impressive length, had limited flexibility compared to the necks of water birds, making the skimming posture mechanically implausible. Their long legs and relatively small feet were well suited for walking efficiently on land. Their beaks, while long, were not laterally flattened for cutting through water resistance, but were instead robust structures better suited for probing the ground or grasping prey. The picture that has emerged from this analysis is of an animal that spent significant time on the ground, walking on all four limbs, with a gait that may have looked somewhat like a very large wading bird, using its long neck and beak to pick up prey items from the surface or probe into vegetation and soil. Prey items would have included small dinosaurs and mammals, lizards, eggs, and possibly carrion. In ecological terms, Ajdarchids may have occupied a niche somewhat analogous to modern storks or marabous, large terrestrial predators and scavengers that also happen to be capable of impressive long-distance flight. This reinterpretation changes the image of the giant pterosaurs dramatically. Instead of enormous aerial predators dominating the skies, we have enormous terrestrial predators that happened to also be capable of flight, using their wings primarily for long-distance movement between foraging areas rather than for active aerial hunting.
In the late Cretaceous ecosystems where azhdarchids were common, this would have made them simultaneously one of the largest terrestrial predators in their environment and the only terrestrial predator capable of moving quickly between widely separated locations. Walking alongside the last dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, these creatures would have been genuinely imposing. A large tyrannosaur was taller, certainly, and heavier by an order of magnitude. But a Quetzalcoatlus standing next to a Tyrannosaurus rex would have been a startling sight. A creature with a head almost as large as that of the tyrannosaur, carried on a neck taller than most of the tyrannosaur's body, attached to a frame that weighed less than a quarter as much. The intelligence of pterosaurs is another area where our understanding has been substantially revised over the past 2 decades, primarily through improvements in imaging technology that allow researchers to reconstruct pterosaur brain anatomy from fossil skulls with unprecedented precision. Early assumptions that pterosaurs, as reptiles, had small and simple brains have been overturned by CT scanning studies, revealing enlarged regions associated with visual processing, balance, spatial orientation, and, in some species, smell. The flocculus, a region of the cerebellum particularly important for coordinating eye movements with head and body movements during flight, was dramatically enlarged in pterosaurs compared to non-flying reptiles, to a degree comparable to its enlargement in modern birds. This makes functional sense. A flying animal needs to be able to stabilize its visual world despite the constant motion of its body during flight, just as a modern aircraft needs sophisticated avionics to compensate for turbulence.
What is more surprising is the degree to which some pterosaur species showed enlargement in brain regions associated with smell, suggesting that olfaction played a more important role in at least some pterosaur ecology than previously suspected. The reproductive biology of pterosaurs was, for a long time, almost entirely unknown, because soft tissue structures like eggs rarely fossilize under normal circumstances. The discovery of fossilized pterosaur eggs, first in China and subsequently in Argentina and other locations, has transformed this situation. The eggs are small relative to the size of the adults, which is consistent with a reproductive strategy in which many small eggs are produced rather than a few large ones. More significantly, the eggshell structure has been analyzed in detail and found to be leathery rather than hard-shelled, similar to the eggs of modern lizards and snakes rather than to the hard-shelled eggs of birds. This has implications for how pterosaur embryos developed, suggesting they required moisture from the surrounding soil or nest material, and for how the hatchlings lived. Analysis of bone maturity in the smallest known pterosaur specimens suggests that hatchlings were already well developed at birth, with functional wings, in a condition described as flaplings by some researchers, meaning they may have been capable of flight very shortly after hatching. If correct, this would imply that pterosaur parental care was limited compared to birds, with young animals becoming independent relatively quickly, an interesting contrast to the extended parental investment seen in modern large flying birds. The ocean was, for pterosaurs, what the savanna is for lions. Not the only environment they inhabited, but the one that reveals most clearly what they were capable of at their most spectacular. The fossil record of marine pterosaurs is disproportionately rich compared to their inland relatives, simply because coastal and marine sediments tend to preserve organic remains more reliably than terrestrial ones. And because pterosaurs that died over water or on shorelines had a reasonable chance of sinking into fine sediment and being preserved, while those that died inland were more likely to be scavenged, scattered, and lost. What this means in practice is that much of what we know about pterosaur diversity, behavior, and ecology comes from coastal environments, and that our picture of pterosaur life is coloured by the particular demands and opportunities of life near the sea. The diversity of feeding strategies among marine and coastal pterosaurs is, when examined in detail, astonishing. Modern seabirds have evolved perhaps a dozen distinct feeding strategies among their roughly 350 species. Pterosaurs, over 160 million years of evolution in and around marine environments, appear to have developed at least as many, and in some cases, strategies with no living analogue whatsoever. Consider the pterosaur called Pterodaustro from the early Cretaceous of Argentina. Pterodaustro had a beak that curved dramatically upward, and its lower jaw was lined with hundreds of long, thin, flexible teeth that formed a dense, comb-like filter. The upper jaw had small, peg-like teeth. The functional interpretation of this anatomy is almost inescapable. Pterodaustro was a filter feeder, wading through shallow water with its lower jaw submerged and its comb teeth filtering small crustaceans and other invertebrates from the water, in a manner functionally similar to a flamingo. The curved beak would have helped keep the filtering surface at the right depth and angle as the animal walked forward through the shallows.
Pterodaustro had a wingspan of approximately 1.5 meters and lived in what appear to have been large, shallow, saline lakes in what is now Patagonia, environments that may have supported enormous flocks of these animals, as similar environments today support millions of flamingos in the Rift Valley of East Africa. The image of thousands of Pterodaustro wading through a Cretaceous salt lake, their curved beaks skimming the surface in synchronized feeding sweeps, is one of the most vivid that pterosaur research has produced, and it is supported by genuine fossil evidence rather than speculation. At the opposite end of the feeding spectrum from the gentle, filter-feeding Pterodaustro were pterosaurs like Anhanguera and its relatives, the ornithochirids, which were among the most accomplished aerial fishers of the Cretaceous. Ornithochirids were large, with wingspans ranging from 4 to 6 meters in the biggest specimens, and they had robust, toothy jaws with prominent rounded crests on both the upper and lower beak tips. These beak crests, which created a distinctive silhouette, may have functioned as hydrodynamic stabilizers during surface skimming attacks on fish, reducing the lateral forces that would have acted on the beak when it entered the water at speed. The wing proportions of ornithochirids were long and narrow, similar to those of modern albatrosses and frigate birds, suggesting they were adapted for dynamic soaring over open ocean, covering enormous distances with minimal energy expenditure by exploiting the wind gradient above the wave surface. Fossils of ornithochirids have been found in marine deposits on multiple continents, including what is now England, Brazil, Morocco, and Australia, which is consistent with a lifestyle of long-range oceanic travel. These were not birds of the coastline, but genuine ocean-going animals, at home thousands of kilometers from land, riding the winds over Cretaceous seas that no modern flying animal can fully replicate. The question of how pterosaurs interacted with the ocean surface during feeding is one that biomechanical researchers have examined in considerable detail, because the physics of water entry at high speed is unforgiving. A bird or pterosaur attempting to catch fish by diving into the water face first at high speed generates enormous forces at the moment of impact. Forces that can break bones and dislocate joints if the anatomy is not specifically reinforced for the purpose. Modern gannets, which are among the most accomplished plunge divers among living birds, have a suite of anatomical specializations for high-speed water entry, including reinforced skulls, air sacs in the chest and neck that cushion the impact, and a body shape that allows entry at angles that minimize deceleration forces. Pterosaurs that fed by surface skimming rather than plunge diving faced a different but equally demanding set of physical challenges. Skimming, the technique used by modern skimmer birds and proposed for various pterosaur species, involves flying with the lower jaw cutting through the water surface while the upper jaw remains in the air. The forces on a lower jaw cutting through water at flight speed are substantial, and the jaw must be both rigid enough not to deflect out of the water and flexible enough not to shatter when it or a subsurface obstacle. Analysis of the jaw microstructure in pterosaurs proposed as skimmers shows reinforcement patterns consistent with resisting these specific forces, providing indirect but meaningful evidence for the skimming behavior hypothesis. Perhaps the most debated feeding strategy proposed for any pterosaur is the aerial skimming behavior suggested for Pteranodon, one of the most famous and most completely known of all pterosaurs. Pteranodon, from the late Cretaceous chalk deposits of Kansas and neighboring states, had a wingspan of up to 7 meters, no teeth at all, and a spectacular backward-pointing crest that extended from the back of the skull and, in large individuals, was longer than the beak pointing forward. For decades, Pteranodon was reconstructed as a surface skimmer, cruising over the shallow inland sea that covered much of North America in the late Cretaceous and snatching fish from the surface with its long, toothless beak. More recent biomechanical analysis has challenged this model, suggesting that the long, slender beak of Pteranodon was not robust enough to withstand the impact forces of rapid surface skimming, and that a plunge diving strategy, similar to that of modern gannets or boobies, is more consistent with the anatomy. Some researchers have proposed instead that Pteranodon was a tactile fisher, flying slowly over the water surface and dipping its beak in to feel for fish rather than visually targeting them, a strategy that would have worked well in turbid or nighttime conditions. The debate has not been definitively resolved, and it illustrates a broader point about pterosaur research. The same anatomy can often support multiple functional interpretations, and distinguishing between them requires evidence that fossilized bones alone cannot always provide. What fossilized bones can provide, when preserved in sufficient detail and numbers, is information about pterosaur population biology and ontogeny, the pattern of growth from hatchling to adult. The size range of known Pteranodon specimens spans from animals with wingspans of approximately 1 meter, which appear to be juveniles, to adults with wingspans of 7 meters or more, representing a roughly 7-fold increase in linear dimensions and perhaps a several hundred-fold increase in mass from hatchling to adult. Growth rates inferred from bone microstructure suggest that Pteranodon grew rapidly during juvenile stages, reaching approximately half of adult size within the first year or two of life, then slowing as it approached adult size.
This rapid early growth is more consistent with the growth patterns of warm-blooded animals than with the slower, more continuous growth typical of cold-blooded reptiles, adding another line of evidence to the case for pterosaur endothermy. The social life of Pteranodon is a subject that has received increasing attention as the sample of known specimens has grown large enough to permit statistical analysis. Kansas and South Dakota have produced hundreds of Pteranodon specimens over more than a century of collecting, making it, by far, the best sampled pterosaur species in terms of sheer numbers. Analysis of this large sample has revealed a striking pattern of size dimorphism. There appear to be two distinct size classes, with the larger class also showing a larger crest, and the smaller class showing a smaller crest. The interpretation of these two size classes as male and female has been controversial, partly because assigning sex to fossil specimens without preserved soft tissue reproductive organs is inherently uncertain, and partly because the size difference between the proposed males and females is so extreme, with males roughly 4 to 5 times the mass of females, that it would be among the most dramatic sexual size dimorphism known in any flying animal. For comparison, the most extreme sexual size dimorphism in modern birds, seen in some birds of prey, involves males being roughly half the mass of females, the reverse of the proposed pattern in Pteranodon. However, the pattern is consistent across hundreds of specimens, and the large crest being associated with the large body size class is consistent with the hypothesis that large body size and large crest were both sexual signals directed by males toward females during courtship, analogous in function, if not in mechanism, to the elaborate plumage of birds of paradise or the antlers of elk. The inland sea that Pteranodon soared over, the western interior seaway, was itself one of the most remarkable geographic features of the Cretaceous world. This shallow epicontinental sea, which existed from approximately 100 million to 66 million years ago, split North America into two landmasses, Laramidia in the west and Appalachia in the east, connected only across the shallow sea that occupied what is now the Great Plains. The sea was warm, perhaps 30 degrees Celsius at the surface in summer, and relatively shallow, rarely exceeding 200 meters in depth. It teemed with life. Ammonites of dozens of species, enormous fish, including the formidable Xiphactinus, which could reach 5 meters in length, mosasaurs that were the apex marine predators of the late Cretaceous, and plesiosaurs that cruised its depths. For Pteranodon and the other pterosaurs that lived around it, the western interior seaway was an essentially unlimited food resource, a body of water covering an area larger than the modern Mediterranean Sea, packed with fish. The pterosaurs that exploited it were correspondingly numerous and diverse, and the chalk deposits that formed from the skeletal remains of countless billions of marine microorganisms that settled to the sea floor of the seaway have preserved their fossils in remarkable condition, giving us our best window into the life of large marine pterosaurs anywhere in the world. Beyond the western interior seaway, the Cretaceous world was dotted with other shallow epicontinental seas, warm coastal margins, and river systems that supported their own distinct pterosaur faunas. The Tethys Sea, which occupied a broad equatorial belt roughly corresponding to the modern Mediterranean and Middle East region, supported pterosaur communities documented in fossil sites from what are now England, France, Spain, Morocco, Egypt, and Lebanon. The famous Lebanese deposits of Hakel and Hajula,
which preserve late Cretaceous marine organisms in extraordinary detail in fine-grained limestone, have yielded pterosaur specimens showing soft tissue details, including preserved wing membranes and, in one remarkable case, what appears to be evidence of a throat pouch, suggesting that at least some pterosaurs had pelican-like pouches for storing fish, a feature that would leave no bony evidence and would have been entirely unknown without exceptional soft tissue preservation. The pterosaur fauna of the southern supercontinent Gondwana, which was separating into the modern southern continents throughout the Cretaceous, shows both similarities to and differences from the northern faunas, reflecting the partial geographic isolation of the southern landmasses. Brazilian deposits, particularly the Santana Formation of the Araripe Basin in northeastern Brazil, have produced some of the most spectacular pterosaur fossils in the world, including ornithochirids, tapajarids, and the remarkable anhangarids, a group of large fish-eating pterosaurs with bony crests on both upper and lower jaws that gave their faces a distinctive shape unlike anything in modern fauna. The Araripe Basin fossils are preserved in calcareous concretions, rounded nodules of carbonate rock that formed around the fossil soon after burial and protected it from subsequent compression and distortion, preserving three-dimensional bone structure in a way that flat, compressed specimens cannot match. Preparing these concretions, carefully removing the surrounding rock matrix to reveal the bones within, is painstaking work that can take hundreds of hours for a single specimen. But the results have been spectacular, producing some of the most completely known and three-dimensionally preserved pterosaur skulls available to researchers. What all of this fossil evidence, from Kansas to Brazil to China to Morocco to Australia, tells us when assembled into a single picture is that the Cretaceous sky was not simply occupied by pterosaurs. It was organized by them. Different species partitioned the aerial and coastal environments in ways that minimized direct competition and maximized the ecological efficiency of the entire flying vertebrate community. Small insectivorous pterosaurs worked the forest margins and lake shores. Medium-sized fish eaters worked the coastal shallows and river mouths. Large oceanic forms soared over open water. Giant azhdarchids ranged across the continental interiors. The sky, from just above the ground to the upper limits of pterosaur flight capability, was divided into ecological zones as distinct from each other as the reef, the open ocean, and the deep sea are divided in the modern marine environment. And this ecological architecture, built over 160 million years of evolutionary refinement, was robust enough to persist through the climatic and environmental changes of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, flexible enough to accommodate the appearance and diversification of birds as a new competing group, and ultimately, vulnerable only to an event so catastrophic and so rapid that no ecological flexibility or evolutionary adaptation could have prepared any large animal for it. The last pterosaurs that ever lived were almost certainly azhdarchids. The latest Cretaceous deposits, those laid down in the final few million years before the impact, consistently show azhdarchid remains while other pterosaur groups are absent or rare, suggesting that by the very end of the Cretaceous, the azhdarchids had become the dominant, if not the only, surviving pterosaur lineage. Whether this represents a genuine decline in pterosaur diversity in the late Cretaceous, as some researchers have argued, or simply a preservational artifact in which Ajdarchid bones, being large and robust, were more likely to be fossilized and found than the delicate bones of smaller species, remains debated. What is clear is that Ajdarchids were present and apparently thriving right up to the boundary. Fossils of large Ajdarchids have been found within meters of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary layer, the thin band of iridium-rich clay that marks the impact event in the geological record worldwide. These animals were alive, or had very recently been alive, when the sky lit up with the energy of an impactor larger than Mount Everest, striking the Earth at a velocity of perhaps 20 kilometers per second. They were, in every meaningful sense, there at the end. What the world lost at that moment was not merely a group of large flying animals.
It was the culmination of 160 million years of aerial evolution, along a path completely distinct from the one that birds were following. A path that had produced solutions to the engineering problem of flight that birds have never replicated, and that we are only now, with the tools of 21st century science, beginning to fully understand. Every time a researcher reconstructs a pterosaur brain from a CT scan and finds it more complex than expected, every time a new specimen reveals a soft tissue structure that changes our understanding of pterosaur biology, every time a biomechanical model produces a new insight into how these animals actually moved through the air, we are recovering something of what was lost. Not the animals themselves, but the knowledge of what they were. And that knowledge, accumulated slowly and painstakingly from fragments of bone and impressions of membrane in ancient stone, is steadily building toward a picture of a world that was, in its aerial dimension, richer and stranger and more spectacular than anything alive today. The relationship between pterosaurs and birds is one of the most interesting ecological stories in the entire Mesozoic, and it has been badly misrepresented in popular accounts for decades. The standard narrative goes something like this. Birds evolved from small theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic, were initially minor players in the aerial ecosystem dominated by pterosaurs, gradually improved their flight capabilities and ecological flexibility through the Cretaceous, and eventually replaced pterosaurs as the dominant flying vertebrates, either by outcompeting them directly or by filling the niches left vacant as pterosaur diversity declined. This narrative has the appealing narrative logic of a biological succession story, a changing of the guard as newer technology replaces older technology. It is also, based on the available fossil evidence, probably wrong in its most important details. The fossil record of the Cretaceous does not show a gradual replacement of pterosaurs by birds. It shows, for most of the Cretaceous, a world in which both groups were diverse and abundant, occupying different ecological niches with limited direct competition. Small pterosaurs, which would have been the group most directly competing with early birds for resources like insects and small fish, do appear to have declined in diversity through the Cretaceous, and this decline may well be related to the rise of birds. But large pterosaurs, particularly the Ajdarchids, show no such decline. They remained diverse and ecologically important right up to the very end of the Cretaceous, and there is no evidence that birds were in the process of replacing them. What killed the large pterosaurs was not birds. It was the same event that killed the non-avian dinosaurs, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, and approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth. The impact of a large asteroid or comet with the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico approximately 66 million years ago. The Chicxulub impactor, as it is known from the crater it left behind, released energy equivalent to approximately 1 billion times the energy of the nuclear weapon detonated over Hiroshima. The immediate effects included massive earthquakes, enormous tsunamis, and a global firestorm ignited by the superheated debris ejected from the impact site, and then re-entering the atmosphere over the following hours. But the longer-term effects were, in many ways, more devastating. The impact threw billions of tons of dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight for months to years. Photosynthesis collapsed globally. The food chain, which depends on photosynthesis at its base, began to unravel from the bottom up. Large animals with high metabolic rates and large caloric requirements were particularly vulnerable because they needed to keep eating in an ecosystem that had suddenly stopped producing food at the rate it had before. Pterosaurs, with their high metabolic rates and their dependence on ecosystems that were themselves collapsing, had no refuge from this catastrophe. Birds survived, not because they were better flyers or more intelligent or more ecologically flexible in any general sense, but because they happened to have characteristics, particularly their ability to eat seeds, which can persist in soil for years, and their relatively small body size, which reduced their caloric requirements, that were specifically useful in the post-impact survival scenario. It was not competition that ended the pterosaurs. It was bad luck on a planetary scale. What we have lost is difficult to fully appreciate. Pterosaurs were not merely large flying lizards with wings grafted on as an afterthought. They were sophisticated, warm-blooded, probably highly intelligent animals whose anatomy represented a genuinely distinct solution to the engineering problem of vertebrate flight. A solution that had been refined over 160 million years and had reached extremes of size and specialization that remain unmatched in the history of life. The world they inhabited, particularly in the late Cretaceous, was one in which the skies were patrolled by animals with wingspans comparable to small aircraft. Animals that could cross oceans and mountain ranges and continental interiors in ways that the ground-bound dinosaurs sharing their world could not. When that world ended 66 million years ago, the skies did not become empty. Birds were already there, and they proceeded to diversify into the 10,000 plus species that exist today. But something fundamental changed. The sky became a smaller place in some ways. The upper limit of what a flying vertebrate could be had been reduced, and it has never recovered. Modern birds include a few species with wingspans approaching 4 meters. The wandering albatross being the most impressive living example. But 4 meters is less than half of 11. No living bird approaches the ecological role of the giant ajdarchids, terrestrial predators the size of giraffes that could fly. No living bird has the dramatic head crests of the tapajarids, or the long stiff tails of the rhamphorhynchoids. The diversity of form that pterosaurs achieved over their 160 million-year tenure has not been replicated by any subsequent group. Birds are extraordinary animals, and they represent a genuine evolutionary success story. But they are not pterosaurs, and the world without pterosaurs is, in a real sense, an ecologically impoverished world compared to what came before. The study of pterosaurs has been transformed in the past 2 decades by a combination of new fossil discoveries and new analytical techniques, and the pace of discovery shows no sign of slowing. China has been particularly productive, with numerous exceptionally preserved specimens from Cretaceous lake deposits in provinces like Liaoning and Xinjiang, revealing details of pterosaur anatomy and ecology that were previously unknown. These Chinese fossils have dramatically expanded our knowledge of the diversity of early Cretaceous pterosaurs, revealed the existence of elaborate soft tissue crests in species where only bony crest remnants, or no crests at all, had previously been known, and provided the best evidence we have for pterosaur integument, eggs, and, in some cases, even stomach contents. A specimen of Sonopterus, a tapirid from the early Cretaceous of China, was found with the remains of a small vertebrate in its stomach region, providing direct evidence that at least some pterosaurs were active predators of vertebrate prey, rather than purely fish eaters or insectivores. The application of computed tomography, essentially medical CT scanning applied to fossil specimens, has allowed researchers to peer inside pterosaur skulls and reconstruct brain anatomy with a level of detail that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. These virtual endocasts, 3-dimensional models of the brain cavity filled in digitally, have revealed that pterosaur brains were far more complex than previously suspected, with regional specializations that compare favorably with modern birds in terms of the development of sensory and motor processing regions. Similarly, synchrotron imaging, which uses extremely powerful X-rays to reveal internal microstructure without physically cutting specimens, has allowed detailed analysis of pterosaur bone microstructure, eggshell composition, and even the chemistry of soft tissue impressions, providing information about physiology and development that bones alone cannot reveal. Biomechanical modeling has become increasingly sophisticated, with researchers using computational fluid dynamics, the same mathematical tools used to design aircraft and wind turbines, to model pterosaur flight in a level of detail that goes far beyond the intuitive estimates that characterized earlier work. These models have produced some surprising results, including the suggestion that some large pterosaurs were actually more efficient flyers than their size might suggest, because their wing shape and proportions were well optimized for dynamic soaring, the technique used by albatrosses to fly enormous distances by repeatedly climbing into the wind and then diving with it, extracting energy from the wind gradient rather than from their own muscles. If large ajdarchids were dynamic soarers, they could potentially have crossed oceans and circled the globe, their fossil distribution on every continent being consistent with such mobility. The question of pterosaur coloration is one that seemed permanently unanswerable until recently, when the analysis of melanosomes, the microscopic pigment-producing organelles found in feathers and other integumentary structures, was applied to pterosaur pycnofibers. Melanosomes come in different shapes associated with different colors, and if their shapes are preserved in fossilized integument, it is possible to infer something about the coloration of the original animal. Studies applying this technique to pterosaur pycnofibers have found evidence for both darker and lighter coloration in different specimens, and in at least one case, evidence for patterning, suggesting that pterosaurs were not uniformly coloured, but had the kind of countershading or patterned coloration seen in many modern birds and mammals. The visual display function of the head crests, if they were indeed signal structures, becomes even more plausible in the context of animals that were already using body coloration as visual signals. What remains most remarkable about pterosaurs, when you stand back and look at the whole 160 million year story, is the sheer evolutionary ambition of the group. They began as small, crow-sized animals in the Triassic, already fully capable flyers despite the absence of any clear fossil ancestry. They diversified through the Jurassic into dozens of ecological roles, filling the aerial world with a variety of forms as different from each other as a hummingbird is from a pelican. They grew, in the Cretaceous, to sizes that pushed the limits of physical possibility, building bodies that were simultaneously the largest flying creatures in history and light enough to become airborne. They developed elaborate social signals in the form of their crests, suggesting a level of behavioral and cognitive complexity that we are only beginning to appreciate. They spread to every continent, adapted to environments ranging from tropical coasts to temperate uplands, and remained ecologically dominant in the air until the very last day of the Cretaceous. And then, in geological terms, they vanished overnight. The same impact that ended the Cretaceous ended their story, along with so much else. But the story of what they were and what their world was like is one that is still being written. In laboratories where CT scanners reveal the contours of brains that last functioned 66 million years ago. In remote field sites where new specimens emerge from rock that has held them since before the first primate climbed its first tree. And in the minds of researchers who look at the growing body of evidence and find themselves revising assumptions that seemed settled only a decade ago. The sky over the late Cretaceous was not empty space between the treetops and the clouds. It was occupied, actively and continuously, by animals of extraordinary diversity and capability. From small insect-catching forms no larger than a sparrow, to giants that cast shadows the size of aircraft over landscapes populated by the last of the great dinosaurs. When we look up at a flock of birds today, we are seeing the descendants of a lineage that survived what the pterosaurs did not. Birds are real and present and magnificent. But they are a smaller chapter of the story of vertebrate flight than they might appear. Because the first chapter, the longest chapter, the chapter that defined what vertebrate flight could be at its most extreme, was written by creatures that left no living descendants, only bones and impressions of wings in ancient stone, and the enduring puzzle of how something so large and so strange and so perfectly adapted to the air could ever have existed at all. The fact that they did exist for longer than we can easily imagine in a world that would be alien to us in almost every respect is one of the most extraordinary facts in the history of life on this planet. And the fact that we are only now, in the early decades of the 21st century, beginning to understand them properly, after 2 centuries of fossil collection and scientific analysis, tells us something important about the limits of what can be known from bones alone.
and about how much remains to be discovered in the rocks that cover most of the Earth's surface, waiting for someone to find the right cliff face, or the right quarry, or the right dried riverbed, and look closely enough to see the paper-thin, hollow bones of an animal that once, 100 million years ago, spread wings wider than a small airplane and launched itself into a sky that belonged entirely to its kind.